Hey everyone, it's Rachel from the library, here for another lunch bunch, and today I'm going to read from Color Outside the Lines, Stories About Love. This is a new book, so I'm very excited to read a story from it. The story I'm going to read is called Starlight and Moondust, and it is by Lori M. Hlee. According to the locals of Little Nova, a witch lived in their woods. They said she brewed potions, cursed trespassers, and grew her garden on the bones of sacrifices. Hlee Q knew better, though. Niam Tais wasn't a witch. She was a shaman. Every Wednesday and Friday, Hlee took the trail that wound through the woods north of town. The trail eventually led to a small house, guarded by lawn sculptures and a brood of chickens, where Hlee delivered a hearty dinner prepared by her mom, with plenty left over for the next day's lunch. It was the duty of the tiny Hmong community in Little Nova to look out for Niam Tais, as the woman lived alone, with no children to care for her. Niam Tais had lost her father and brother in the war, and then her mother to sickness in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The history of tragedy and frantic escape was the shared story of all refugees. But how Niam Tais came to be here, in Little Nova, was a different kind of story entirely. When Niam Tais was a young woman, she'd woken from her bed, driven from the sweat-damp sheets by the humidity and the bright face of the moon through the window of her family's hut. She'd wandered down to the riverbank and fallen asleep at its shore, to the gentle shushing of the water. The next morning, she brushed moondust from the creases of her clothes as her thoughts grasped for the vestiges of a dream about a man in shining robes and a string of white stones against his brow. It was a sign, the village elder decided, that she'd been called by the spirits to the revered duties of a shaman. Some years later, after the war had displaced her halfway around the world, she fell asleep with the moonlight full against the backs of her eyelids and dreamed again of the Moon Emperor. In the dream, he shot an arrow across the night sky, a streak of brilliant silver, and beckoned her to retrieve it. As in her childhood, she'd obeyed the calling and ended up in the sleepy town of Little Nova. What Niam Tais did after that wasn't clear, and Hlee had never been satisfied by the open ending. Instead, she couldn't help but wonder if the story hadn't yet found its conclusion. She shifted her backpack, the Tupperware inside clacking together, and kicked at a pine cone lying in her path. On any given day, Little Nova was a quiet town, the stillness broken only by the grinding roar of old cars. In the woods, though, the silence took on a presence all its own, a companion that Hlee always welcomed. As she jumped over a narrow brook nearly dried out from the summer heat, laughter flitted through the trees. She paused, her skin prickling as the wind slid warm fingers against her neck. The laughter came again, closer this time, along with the snap of twigs beneath heavy feet. Hunching her shoulders, she lowered her head and continued walking more quickly. "Hlee?" She winced and glanced toward the voice. Amelia Hart stood some distance away, her blonde hair slightly mussed. Her boyfriend, Hlee thought his name might be Sam, stood behind her, arm draped over her bare shoulders, his fingers playing with the strap of her pink tank top. "Were you spying on us?" she asked, glossy lips curling, her words sharp with laughter. Hlee's face went hot. She stared hard at her worn gray sneakers, wishing Amelia would stop talking so Hlee wouldn't feel like she was fleeing. "No," she mumbled. She gestured to the trail. "Oh, her," Amelia said. "Hey, Sam, you remember when Rena lost her dog?" Hlee walked faster, fingers clutched tight around her backpack straps. But the silence that had only moments ago been her friend carried the snide words straight to her ears. "She found bones washed up down the brook a couple months ago, and she thinks the witch probably kidnapped it for one of her sacrifices." "That's a lie," Hlee thought, teeth clenched tight. "You're not hiding someone's pet in your backpack, are you? Are you her delivery service?" Their laughter rang through her thoughts long after she left them behind. Her hands balled into fists as her heart raced, nostrils flaring with every furious breath. Hlee had begged her parents to move for years, but they liked Little Nova. They liked the size and the distance from larger cities. The trees, crowned by the peaks of distant mountains, reminded them a little of the country they'd left behind. So Hlee said nothing, simmering in her resentment. Anything she said in defense of Niam Tais would be turned against her, and the last thing she wanted was to call more attention to herself. It was better to try to be invisible than to invite ridicule for things she couldn't control. Ahead, Niam Tais' house materialized from behind the trees. It was small and leaned a bit to one side. The paint had long since peeled from the door and window frames, exposing old wood that curled away from the walls. Chickens roamed the yard, the coop visible behind a vibrant garden that sat to the right of the house. Above the door hung a chipped sign that said, "Welcome." The sight of it made Hlee's arm vibrate with renewed anger. Niam Tais embraced what and who she was and made no apologies for it, but Hlee didn't have the same confidence. Sometimes she wished Niam Tais would be less flagrantly different, given the way she reflected on the rest of the Hmong community and on Hlee. She stalked past the garden, scattering the chickens, who squawked at her intrusion. The pungent aroma of cilantro, green onions, and lemongrass assaulted her nostrils. Once the house was out of sight, she pressed her back against a tree and tossed her backpack into the dirt. She sank to the soft earth, her hair snagging against rivets of bark that tugged sharply at her scalp. Although the sun had only just begun to set, the moon was already visible through the branches. It was nearly full, milky, and stark against the purpling sky. Because she was looking up, she saw the exact moment when a shock of silver streaked through the sky, brief and brilliant. Her eyes widened. Before she'd even consciously decided, she made a wish. Please, please let me find where I belong. There has to be more than this. She felt instantly like an idiot. Kids made wishes on falling stars, not 16-year-olds who knew better. Her mom had once told her that falling stars were the tears of the Moon Emperor, whose daughter had been taken beneath the sea as a bride for the serpent god. Every night, the Moon Emperor sat on the water's surface and peered down in the hopes of glimpsing his lost daughter. That was why you couldn't point at the moon. The Moon Emperor regarded it as an accusation. In retribution, he descended from his obsidian throne astride his rainbow-scaled dragon and slashed at your ear as you slept. Hlee knew, of course, that the story wasn't the least bit true. Hmong folk tales were passed down orally from parent to child, sibling to sibling, embellished or altered, depending on who told it. But the warning was so ingrained that she still couldn't bring herself to point at the stupid thing. She'd made the mistake of telling a classmate that once. He'd mocked her for months by shouting her name as he clutched his ear and pointed at the sky. It was infuriating, really. What made wishing on a falling star any less ridiculous than not pointing at the moon? They were equally unlikely, equally childish. The only difference was the culture each belief came from, which, she supposed, made all the difference to some people. She sighed and bent to retrieve her backpack. The Tupperware inside clanked dully. She swore, guilt chasing away the last of her anger. It wasn't Niam Tais' fault that people like Amelia were ignorant and hateful, and the only thing her brooding had accomplished was to keep Niam Tais waiting for her dinner. The next day, Hlee's mother spent the entire morning on the phone with Niam Tais. Hlee waited anxiously to see if she'd be scolded for the night before. But when her mother at last came into her bedroom, it was only to say she'd volunteered Hlee to keep Niam Tais' new guest company. Hlee still felt guilty enough not to argue. When she'd at last shown up on Niam Tais' doorstep, with the food gone cold in the Tupperware, Niam Tais had been so relieved. She'd worried that something had happened to Hlee in the woods, which made Hlee feel like a complete heel. When she reached Niam Tais' house again, she spotted the guest immediately. He sat out front, pale hair gleaming beneath the midday sun. It wasn't unusual for Niam Tais to have guests. Townsfolk showed up regularly to purchase fresh vegetables and her various herbal remedies. Distant relatives sometimes visited for the weekend. But the boy sitting on Niam Tais' favorite wicker stool was a white teenager. Hlee had been expecting an older Hmong woman, like the aunt who stayed with Niam Tais a few months ago. The boy was sawing at a wooden sculpture with a small knife. Splinters of wood lay scattered around his shoes. As she approached, his gaze lifted. For the briefest of moments, his eyes flashed silver, like the sudden flare of a falling star. Then she was looking into bright gray eyes, framed by lashes so pale that they could have been frosted in white. "Hi," he said, mouth stretching into a broad smile. He brushed flecks of dirt and wood off his jeans. "You must be Hlee." "Yeah," she replied, uncertain. She gave him an awkward hip-level wave and then hurried past him into the house. Aside from the bathroom and the altar room, the house was mostly one large space. A bed took up the corner, piled with blankets. Hlee recognized her mom's embroidery among the pillows. A large cloth hung on one wall, depicting a story depicting figures with black hair and traditional Hmong clothing in careful skilled stitches. Beneath it sat an enormous cube of a television that was probably several decades old. Niam Tais stood at the kitchen counter, bent over a heavy stone mortar and wielding a pestle the size of a small baseball bat. Crumpled sheets of old newspapers crowded the countertop, nestling bunches of dried herbs. The woman greeted her, a smile splitting her brown face. Niam Tais was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet, with dark hair that had just begun to gray pulled back into a messy bun. Her diminutive size was deceiving, though. A huge cleaver rested in a butcher block at the far side of the counter, and Hlee had seen her take apart a pig carcass with terrifying efficiency. Hlee didn't doubt the woman could take care of herself, despite the way the Hmong elders clucked in disapproval at Niam Tais' choice to remain unmarried. Although Hlee understood Hmong well enough, she couldn't really speak it herself. Niam Tais was the same, except with English. So Hlee stood awkwardly inside the door as she struggled to find the right words to ask about the boy outside. Frustration pressed at her temples as the language eluded her. Giving up, she asked in English instead, and they managed to piece together enough of a conversation for Hlee to gather that the boy was the son of a friend. "Can I help?" Hlee gestured to the countertop and the array of herbs. Niam Tais shook her head, instead pointing to the table where a tray of football-shaped sweet buns waited, steaming faintly. With a polite nod, Hlee wrapped a warm bun with a napkin and grabbed a second for the boy outside. He was cutting ineffectually at the sculpture again, the slight curve of his mouth indicating he wasn't worried about his lack of skill. The sculpture in question was supposed to be a crane, its slender neck extended. Niam Tais was wondering if you wanted one," she said as she looked up again. The genuine joy in his face as he took the proffered sweet bun made her insides squirm. "Thanks." He took an enormous bite. His eyes fluttered shut, the pleasure in his expression so acute that it was almost indecent. Her face went hot, and she looked away. Nearby, a chicken perched on the stone cap of a large mushroom sculpture. She shooed the bird away and took its place on the mushroom. "I'm Argus," he said between bites. Making small talk wasn't a talent she possessed, so she said nothing. Instead, she watched the chickens putter about the yard as she ate through the middle of the sweet bun, where it was stuffed with vibrant green pandan jelly. Argus shoved the last of the bread into his mouth, swallowed thickly, and asked, "So, what's your story?" Brushing crumbs off her fingertips, Hlee raised one eyebrow and repeated, "My story? Like, where did I come from?" She hated that question. "Where are you from?" It immediately set her apart, made her something other. Her parents had lived in Boston when they had her, and then they moved to Little Nova when she was 2. Hlee was Hmong, but that didn't mean she wasn't also completely American. "Not necessarily," he said. "Where you're from and what your story is can be 2 completely separate things." She didn't know what he meant, so she shrugged one shoulder. He seemed not to mind, because he retrieved the knife from the dirt and held it out, handle first. She shook her head. "I'll ruin it." "Not any more than I already have." He grinned. "If it makes you feel better, she said I could resculpt it however I wanted." Niam Tais rarely let anyone touch her mismatched lawn sculptures. Hlee supposed that if the woman had welcomed this boy into her home, he couldn't be anywhere near as bad as the kids in Little Nova. She rose from the mushroom cap, and they swapped seats. "Niam Tais has been chipping away at this thing for years," she said, running her fingers along the jagged indentations left by Argus. "Yeah, I think she just wanted to keep me from doing any more damage in there," he said. His ears turned pink as he grimaced. "I threw out a bunch of the bark shavings she'd left on the counter." Lee's eyes went wide. "Those are her medicines. She sells those." He winced, his smile self-deprecating. I didn't know. I thought I was helping clean up. She put me outside with the chickens. To her complete surprise, Hlee dropped her head back and laughed. Okay, we will pause there for today. And next time we'll pick up and see what Hlee and Argus's story is. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye!